Yeah, I should make it clear that Philadelphia Musical Academy was not attached to Villanova. We were, close, geographically close. And there was the way Villanova ended up having a jazz festival. There was a professor there that was a jazz aficionado, loved the music, and thought, PMA, Temple, St. Joe's, LaSalle, the schools in our area, in the Philadelphia area, would probably have enough musicians that would come to participate. But they allowed other schools to come in too, so you didn't have to be from Pennsylvania at all. And the beautiful part of that first jazz festival for me, not only feeling so good about playing and doing well, but the judges were Phil Woods. So I got to know Phil Woods and Stan Kenton, who ended up, I'll say, pleading with, and I say that humbly, for me to be the lead alto player in his band when I was 23 years old, and I never did it. And one of my deep regrets in life, I had just started some graduate school at Temple and wasn't ready to get out of school yet. He was in Los Angeles, but what a great mentor. And I had just gotten married, actually, and we kid about, like, Sherry, my wife, picking up the phone and, "Hi, this is Stan Kenton, is Michael?" Yeah. Anyway, I have a couple of those experiences where I almost fell off a chair myself getting a phone call like that. But getting to know them, and the other judge that I could have been with for 24 hours at a time was Bob Field, who was John Coltrane's producer. So Bob Field had all of these stories that I could have just sat and and listened to for days about his rigorous practice routines.
It's interesting that you came when Stan Kenton spearheaded the whole jazz in high schools, because you were saying you didn't go to high school. Your high school didn't have a jazz band that you're part of. So you were right on the cusp of that happening with, you know what I'm talking about?
At those years,
nationwide, trying to get jazz in the high schools.
To what extent were these things integrated, or the blacks and whites mingling in all this? It sounded like a lot of this was mostly white kids doing this at that time.
You know what? I would say, yeah, I would say it wasn't equal at all in those festivals, because I don't think we had as many African American musicians in college then either. So they weren't in the schools. I remember Lou Marini was the other saxophone player that was at every festival that we did. Yeah, but you're right about that. Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
There wasn't as much mingling.
No.
No, they were going to Grendal.
A lot of the jazz guys were going to Grendal.
Yeah.
PMA wasn't like you weren't studying. Were you taking classes there? Other than composition, right? But were you taking?
You mean other academics?
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
So you were involved.
Well, the Philadelphia Musical Academy, it was a complete college program, not just music. It was the conservatory model. So music was the reason you were there and the most important aspect, but they had a music education degree. So you had to take the other courses that were appropriate for one to attain that degree. And I did take a few of the science courses I could grab at the time. I took a biology course at the time. I remember taking my first psychology course there at the time. Took a course in economics, and I don't know why. Never helped me know anything about money, but I remember we shared some of the same professors with the art school then, which was the Philadelphia College of Art, which now is part of the University of the Arts as well. And I guess they were, more than likely, being too young to really know what they were about, I would imagine they were professors probably from Penn, Temple, or Drexel, who picked up a part-time little gig, maybe as adjuncts at these art schools, so that people could get properly degreed in order to be able to teach later in life.
All right, let's move on to the early what was the first professional gig
Of mine?
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
And then, where was it? Who was with? Was it your little group or your band? And what type of music were you playing for your first professional gig?
My first professional gig was right in the little old town of Ardmore, Pennsylvania. And it was at a place called the Palambaro Hall, which was a place where, a congregation, I was going to say, where the Italian men in the Italian neighborhood of Ardmore, which is not where I lived, but only a few blocks away. My mother actually had lived in that area earlier. So these were Italian men that smoked a lot of stogie cigars and ate a lot of Italian food and went to play cards. I guess, they'd have dinner with their family. I'm going back now, to the generation before me and even the one before that. So these guys, worked hard all day in those days, and, men didn't, 2 generations before me didn't spend a whole lot of time with their kids, I don't think. They worked their big deal of 8 hours, which they thought the wife was, meanwhile, working 24 hours. But as far as they were concerned, they worked their hard 8 hours. They had dinner with the family and then would go to this Palambaro Hall to have a couple drinks, maybe a bite or two, play cards, and then go home and go to sleep. So one of those members, who was a concrete mason, was the father of one of my best friends. And he said to me, why don't you guys start to play here? Pick a night on the weekend, on Friday nights. I'll set it up for you. We have a stage. We have a big room. And he helped us and did everything for us, really. I was 15. And we played there every Friday night. And he would get the sodas and the popcorn and the potato chips or whatever else it would take. And the kids would come in and maybe pay $1, I guess. I think the most I ever made in a night was $15, which we thought was wonderful. And they were all friends of mine that I had grown up with in the neighborhood. They all played music. One of them I later went to medical school with, but none became a professional musician. But we all played together. And I bet we did it for, I bet, a year. So that was my, we played dance music, we played rock and roll, we played swing music, whatever, but it was jitterbugging kids and, I think it was even probably before the twist was out. So it wasn't even that. So it was probably more swing music, that kind of rock and roll swing music, I guess, one of the guys sang in the band. I did not at that time. So one of the guys sang, and it was like pop music of the day. And I was, it's interesting. I tell this story too to some people. I was so oblivious, other than what I had to learn for playing, to pop music. I mean, in high school, when people my age or even younger will say, the nostalgic feeling they get when they hear a song, that was so popular when they were in high school. I have no idea what the popular songs were when I was in high school. I never listened to pop radio, never. I listened to whatever jazz radio in those days out of Philadelphia I could find, and just music at home. But I did have to learn to play music. And then, from that gig on, I mean, other gigs appeared similar to that in Philadelphia. And then in the summertime at the seashore, and Ocean City and not Ocean City, but Summers Point and Wildwood in those days, so I did those things too in the summer. But I don't think from the age of 15, I ever did anything on a weekend but play music. I mean, I had gigs from that age. So I had money for college. I mean, I made money every weekend,
All right. When was your first jazz gig, and what was your first jazz band that you put together?
My first jazz gig, the real jazz gig. Okay, I think I wrote a couple of notes for myself.
That's fine.
Yeah, I did. Okay. My first real jazz gig purely hired to play jazz was at Grendal's Lair on South Street in Philadelphia. So I was college age, and Grendal's Lair was becoming a real cool place for young people to go and listen. It wasn't jazz every night, but the young guy who owned it had jazz a couple nights a week, and that was like my first real jazz gig and the highlight of my life at that time, because you could really go in and play jazz, solely jazz, and not be reprimanded or coaxed or bothered to play other forms of music. Because I will say that I would sneak in jazz things in my earlier days on gigs that weren't jazz gigs if I thought I could pull it off, but oftentimes, and most often, I'd be told that's not what you were hired to play, so please don't do that. So Grendal's was great early on, and then I know I had a few real jazz gigs at the International House at the University of Pennsylvania. That same time period, I remember playing.
What time, are we talking about the mid-60s or?
I'm talking about mid to late 60s. Yeah.
And you were still playing alto at this point, or no?
No, I was playing tenor by then.
Okay.
Yeah, I was playing both, but really tenor by that time.
Okay.
Yeah. I think in the early part I had alto and tenor on the stand, and I.
Go ahead. Well, I was just going to say, let's back up and tell me when you decided to switch.
Okay.
Because you were mentioning Coltrane.
Okay. So in my earlier years, I mean, I had played alto saxophone up to the point, just about, I guess, when I was ready to start at Philadelphia Musical Academy, but I was still playing alto. But I was starting to listen to so much Coltrane at that time that I was one of those guys who I think started to emulate at least his sound. I mean, you can never hope to be John Coltrane. I mean, but yeah, whatever you could get from him, you wanted to take. I was never naive enough to say, no, I'm going to play like John Coltrane. I mean, there is only one. There will always only be one. I feel that way about Michael Brecker too, by the way, who was younger, but his sound and his whole force was so unique, at that time. Anyway, so I started to play tenor more than alto at that time, and at the same time, I think I started to maybe slide away from the alto. Although I never stopped loving Cannonball, Andoli, never. So, and I talk about him more than I do Charlie Parker, I guess. Cannonball always had that thing about his playing, it made me happy. He always sounded happy. He always appeared to be happy. He was articulate on the stage. So I don't think I ever lost my attachment to the alto, but I started to play it less because I was so taken by John Coltrane. I mean, if you were to come inside, you would see some of the earlier Train LPs that I have maybe 3 or 4 copies of, one of which is unwrapped. The other ones still have the cellophane around them. So I would buy 4 Giant Steps LPs, and 3 of them are still have cellophane. But so he became really the driving force for me, and I also started to play soprano at that time because he played the soprano saxophone as well. And I should mention that I think it was 1967. Coltrane was playing at Pep's, which was at Broad and South, and I was 22 at that time, and I went to Pep's to listen to him, and I guess most of our people will know that he was a soulful, sweet, kind, soul, generous man, that I stood against the wall and listened to him for the hour and 20-minute set. I think that I timed at that time that he played. And when he came off the stage, he walked by me, and I put my hand out and I said, "Mr. Coltrane, I just would love to meet you. I'm a young saxophone player. And he took my hand and held it like, took it and held it. And I didn't want to wash that hand for 3 weeks later. And he really did. I mean, he like held it and grabbed it. I mean, he was just this beautiful human being, you know, that cared so much. And then the stories that we hear about him, he left me. I stayed there because I wanted to hear his next set. And within 3 or 4 minutes, he went to the back where the bathrooms or dressing room was at Pep's. I was never back in that area. And you heard him play again. I guess he was starting to practice between sets, which he did so often in those days. Bob Thiel, in fact, who I mentioned earlier, meeting in the jazz festivals, the collegiate festivals, used to tell us that even when they had business meetings about Coltrane with the labels, like Prestige or something, Train would always ask if he was needed at that meeting for any decisions. He would always ask if they could be done at his apartment in the city then that he lived, because when they didn't need him, he always would go leave the table or the area and go into another room and get another 20 minutes of practicing it, you know. Yeah.
Okay, so by the time you're doing professional jazz gigs, you're already on the tenor, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so who played that gig with you at Grendal's?
My first gig at Grendal's, I had Steve Weiner, I remember, playing trumpet. Had Stanley Johnson was the pianist who also went to PMA at that time. Ron Gelati was the bassist, and Jimmy Paxton was the drummer. Yeah, so, and that group stayed intact for all of our college years, and then even following our college years, we played together. I mean, during college, I was offered a State Department tour of some Iron Curtain-ish feeling countries, which I turned down. I didn't really want to travel there. I wasn't that brave at that age, that I maybe hadn't traveled enough to feel comfortable doing that. So I turned it down. But that band did stay together for a number of years. Stanley Johnson went to law school, so another pianist came into play. Eric Friedman was the pianist at that time, and the bass player changed to a guy named Chip Bond. Actually, Ron Gelati, I think, moved out of Philadelphia at that time. Yeah, but the band stayed intact.
And what was the repertoire like? You were doing
all jazz, and a lot of what we were writing ourselves, because we were all kind of prolific writers at that time. Even in those jazz festivals, a lot of the music was ours, you know. But you know, I mean, obviously some Coltrane music and all of that. But a lot of it was ours. So a lot of it was original music.
When did you start? You started recording around then at all, or were you recording other stuff?
My first recording. Well, I guess we can bridge here into my life with Philly International Records.
That'd be a good segue.
Because that was, for me, started, I guess, in 1970, when I started to get calls to play in the band, Mother, Father, Sister, Brother, that studio group in those days. So I played, the contractor in those days was a man named Don Renaldo, who would hire us. I mean, it was just that decade, by the way, this bridges a decade almost. The decade of the 70s in Philadelphia was almost every day of the week in the studio for Kenny Gamble and Leon Huff. And they were so active, and they had so many hit groups and records that there were many nights you barely got out of the studio till you had to be on call the next morning at 10 o'clock. And I remember arrangers not even being able to finish the arrangement in time because they had just finished 2 charts for the day before, and you'd get there at 10 o'clock and you'd sit for a couple of hours till the arranger finished even what they had to write. And I will proudly say, in behalf of Leon and Kenny, there was never an hour for which you were not paid. When you were contracted to be in that band as a studio musician, if you were called for 10, the clock started at 10 o'clock. You were properly paid as a musician, the scale for a recording session. It went into your pension fund, and it always did. The only negative thing I ever remember about any of those dates, I guess a cute story in a way, was the contractor, Don Renaldo, had been a guy like my dad with bands around the Philadelphia area for years. He was a violinist in hotels, even in those days when, you know, live music was so ubiquitous, I guess, everywhere. And Don was the boss. You know, he was like a father figure. He told you what to do, how to do it. And as those of us who were younger started to be looked at by some of the producers as having maybe a feel for some of the music or the way it should go, that if anyone like myself was maybe brazen enough to offer advice to the producer, you got a call at home later that night by Don Renaldo, who said, "Listen, kid, I'll talk to the producers. You play your saxophone."
So, when you first started playing there, was Sam Reed contracting the horns?
Who?
Sam Reed?
No, not for me. Sam was always there, but when I got called, and I'm saying 70, maybe it was 71 when I got called.
Because he actually left in 71, and until then he was.
But I knew Sam totally well. In fact, I just said happy birthday to him on Facebook.
85th birthday yesterday.
Yeah, so it might have been after Sam, but I may, you know what though, excuse me, I may have been called by Sam initially, because I've known him forever. And then maybe from that it went to Don. When Don
what happened was Sam was doing the horn contracting, and then he left in 71. And
Okay.
Don Renaldo took over. Don used to do the strings.
Yeah.
And Sam did the horn.
That's right.
And then when Sam left, Don did everything.
So that's how it started. Then I probably did get called by Sam.
That's what I wanted to double
yeah.
check. He said the last thing he contracted was Me and Mrs. Jones by Billy Paul.
Well, I was on that session, of course.
Eddie Green
And then he left.
Yeah.
He went to L.A. So, but I wanted to double check that. So you think maybe the first few times?
I bet that's how it did happen, because I knew Sam well back then. He's older, but I knew him well. So I bet he called me first, because I was playing. I was so busy in the city. I was playing so much in Philadelphia, you know, that I guess I got to know him early. And then Don, like you said, eventually started to hire the horns too.
When Sam left, Don took over the horns,
Yeah.
horns as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Does anybody want to take a break or anything?
I'm okay.
Okay, hey, Jason? Okay. All right, what, do you remember some of the clubs, just to stick it in around that time, that you used to either go to besides Pep's
Sure.
in the 70s or played in at that time?
I think in addition to Grendal's Lair, which I mentioned earlier, Pep's was real active, but for celebrities, for names, not for me, as a kid at that, or a young guy at that time. And then around the corner was the Showboat, which was on Lombard, between Broad and 15th. And they also, in fact, Miles played there, and I saw Cannonball there too. Coltrane always played at Pep's. So those two clubs for us as young people in the city were the cats to listen to. It was right there for you. You know, we were living pretty much in the city and there in school and all of that. And in addition to Grendal's Lair, soon after, Stephen Starr, who's a restaurateur now, opened Starr's, which was on Bainbridge, 2nd and Bainbridge, which also became another great place to play. And I think the guy that originally owned Chris's had another little spot, and I can't remember where it was, because he eventually had a little club somewhere where some of us used to have the opportunity to play also. Chris himself, and then he opened where Chris's is now on Sansom Street. Oh no, I do remember. I'm sorry. It was in the New Market. That's going back too, you know, in the New Market, yeah.
Now, were there any jam sessions that you attended during those times where you just sat in and with other jazz players?
Oh yeah, I mean,
Where?
well, I mean, all those clubs, you know,
Right.
they were all of those clubs. I think gave us the opportunity to just go in, and if you had your horn with you, you got a chance to sit in and play a little bit and have a jam session. I don't think in Philly we did as many as the young guys today call them sessions. We called them jams. We called them jam sessions, but I don't think we had it anywhere close to the magnitude that the New York guys did. You know, in every loft and all of that went on so much there. I don't think we, at least I didn't. I wasn't a participant in that many houses, you know. But another name that's just coming to light as we're talking about is the young Gregory Herbert, who was so active in Philly at that time, you know. And I remember we all would play at different jam sessions. And I think there were a couple houses in those days that we were able to play in. And then as the school, by the way, Philadelphia Musical Academy became more adaptable, and we could play in some of those rooms that have jam sessions in there as well. But before my time, I think to maybe guys older and maybe the generation before, the days of getting a young guy on a bandstand and playing the toughest tune at the fastest tempo and in the hardest key, that didn't really, that was not part of my growing up. I don't remember that being done. I remember the older guys being more like mentors than people who wanted to embarrass you.
I think a lot of times those are because of Charlie Parker and that whole he threw the cymbal, the ride
Yeah.
cymbal. I think that a lot of that is urban myth because almost all the I haven't heard one story, Michael, where a Philadelphia musician we've talked to said, "Oh, I was so embarrassed and they treated me like crap." That it was usually very, like you said, mentoring, nurturing.
Yeah.
Everybody I've talked to, I don't know if there was none of that cutting contest kind of feel, you know. But
And
go ahead.
I just was going to say too, the guys that I looked up to, and even the guys in my band, because we were a few years younger, were the guys that were doing the Mike Douglas show at that time. I mentioned Roger. I don't know if I mentioned Roger's name. Roger DeLulo was the trombonist. Mike Natale, the trumpeter, and also Vince Trombetta, who was a wonderful teacher. In fact, Vince taught Michael Brecker early on, and he was a terrific educator and wonderful player himself. But we really looked up to them because they were only a couple of years younger, and they had the greatest day gig in the world.
Right.
They got to play this live television show, you know, every day, Mike Douglas. So they were making a really good living, and they could kind of bop up all around the city at night and play, you know, jazz gigs and have a ball and have fun. So.
What's the trumpet player who booked the Valley Forge Music Fair? Italian guy.
Tony Marcion.
Marcion.
I have a good story about him.
Yeah.
Want to hear it?
Yeah.
Another trumpeter who comes to mind, not a jazz player per se, but a brilliant trumpeter, was the name of Tony Marcion. And that's how it was pronounced anyway, in Italian.
By the way, he and Sam Reed went to Mass Bomb together.
Oh, okay. So Tony Marcion was the contractor and the leader at the Valley Forge Music Fair, which was also a great gig for some of the guys that were able to get that and do that gig. And his son, by the way, I'll mention, Nick Marcion now, is like, I think I'll say the number one, not the number one, but one of the two, if it's that, first calls in New York City for any lead trumpet jazz type gig that goes on. And theater. I mean, he's the cat in New York. His name is Nick Marcion. Brilliant trumpet player. But his dad, as an older guy, came to my rescue once in a sense. I had gotten called to play in the pit orchestra of one of the theaters. I was 23, and as happy as I was, some of the older musicians in the pit orchestra, especially in the woodwind section, weren't so happy to see this young guy come in and displace one of their guys. And they tortured me and taunted me. Did you put a good read on today? It doesn't sound like you did. Did you have time to practice before you got here? Yeah, it was tough. And after maybe a week or two of that, I was still there. Tony Marcion stood up with his trumpet in his hand during a rehearsal and said, if I hear one more word out of any of you like that, the trumpet goes on your head. And it stopped. And they all put up with me from that point on. He was their butt. I mean, they were all, but they were torturing me and making it almost impossible for me to play in a relaxed fashion. I mean, it was all the doubles, clarinet, flute, soprano, alto. I had a baritone saxophone, so I used to come in with this arsenal of instruments, nervously sit down with all these great players. Harry Carabell was one of those players, great clarinetist in town. So anyway, it was a nice thing that he was able to do for me.
All right, let me ask you. You studied with Dennis Sandole. Can you tell me how old you were when you started studying with him, and how was it?
After my time with Buddy Savitt, the next formal teacher I had was Dennis Andoli. Dennis, for those of you that may not know, has always been so highly regarded as the master of being a jazz teacher, a jazz educator. Didn't matter what instrument you played. He wasn't teaching you your instrument, so you had to have enough command of your particular instrument so that he could give you the information that he needed to give you and teach you how to improvise better, get greater harmony skills and hearing, and also there was always a composition piece to his lesson. Dennis was a character, and knowing I was going to do this interview today and that we would probably get to talk about Dennis, I got out a paper book I have with Dennis's handwritten poetry in it. He was a very active poet, and I guess he would give all of his students his poetry as he would write it. And he inspired me at a young age also to begin. And in his paper book that I have some of my poetry stuck in there from different periods of my life. But he was an absolutely brilliant man. I never heard him play guitar other than during a lesson when he would demonstrate something. But his lessons were unique and so comprehensive because he would always give you something, as I expressed earlier, to work on. But it was not just a figure, so to speak. It would be like a 4 or 8 bar phrase and ask you to do that and develop it in all the keys of, so you could play it in any other key. He would ask you to sit at the piano and play the chords that went along with that transcription that he or that you had done. And then he would always ask you to write a piece, compositionally, give you a chordal or a harmonic structure and say, write something within this framework. So it was a lot of work that you had to do within that week, or maybe 2 week period if you took it every other week. So I met Dennis once before my first lesson and went to talk to him, and he told me what it would be about, what the fee was, and so forth. He had a little place around Broad and Pine. It was right off of Pine Street in a little, kind of almost like an alleyway. It was a great apartment. And my first lesson, I knew Pat Martino, the great guitarist, who I later got to play with in life and tour with, had studied with him, as did Coltrane, by the way. I think Coltrane took 3 lessons from Dennis. Yeah.
Yeah, you did.
McCoy time too.
And McCoy Tyner as well. So my first lesson, I'm on the first floor playing my tenor warming up to go upstairs to where his studio was. I think it was 2 floors above that, ground level, then another floor, and then where he taught me. And as soon as I walked in, he said, Michael, he talked almost like Miles Davis. That's how he spoke to you. And he spoke, by the way, his vocabulary was more extensive than I think any of us could ever hope to have if we did it every day. He had an amazing, amazing vocabulary. So you couldn't even understand what he was saying to you once in a while or often. Anyway, he said, Michael, why are you playing the tenor saxophone? I said, again, I'm like 17 years old. I said, that's what I play. He said, no, why are you playing the tenor saxophone? I said, because that's what I love to play. You know, I did play alto saxophone a lot before, but he said, well, it's time for you to learn to play outside of the range of your alto saxophone. Because I heard you warming up while I was giving the last lesson, and you stay in the range of the alto saxophone. I don't hear you going to the bottom of the tenor, nor the top of the tenor saxophone. And that in itself was such an astute statement and awareness of his. Obviously, I paid great attention to it. So I obviously learned to work on that and pay attention to that. My second lesson with Dennis Sandole was, as I was about to begin my lesson with him on that third level, he said, oh, I think Pat Martino is probably here. So he went down and said hello to Pat, and he walked up with Pat, and he said to me, it's okay with you if Pat sits in on your lesson, isn't it? And here I am, nervous about, scared to play in front of Dennis Andoli what my lesson was, let alone have Pat Martino, who was only a couple years older than I am, or is only a couple years older than I am. But, you know, myself and other guys in Philly looked at Pat as this iconic figure. I mean, he was, you know, so brilliant and talented and had done so much already by the time he was 19 or 20. I mean, he had done so much, and as great as he was, I was a total wreck playing in front of Pat Martino, but I got through it, you know. And as time went on, got to know Pat so well over the years, but we always admired everything that he did so much. And 2 other nice stories about Dennis, if I may. One was, he was a Jehovah's Witness. And when you finish your lesson, I think it was $10 at the time, if I remember correctly, in the beginning. You would take out the $10 bill or 2 5s, whatever you had. And my first time I went to hand it to him, and he said, no, I can't touch money. Just pay Kitty. And he had a little porcelain cat on his piano. And you put the money under the piano, and you learn to do that. Not thinking about it a lot. I don't know, maybe 7 lessons later.
Right.
I went to a lesson, and I guess I forgot to get the right amount of money, and I had a $20 bill. And when I finished my lesson, I said, Dennis, I can't pay you today. I forgot to get this change, and I only have a $20 bill. He said, no, that's okay. I have change. And he did touch the kitty money. I think that's a great story. And the other one, which is a cute story, is when we were winning all these collegiate jazz festivals. Steve Weiner, the trumpeter, was also studying with Dennis. And I will be completely honest with you and say to you that I'm a learner my whole life. I've always been. I always want to learn more. I never think I'm really fully developed about anything I do or learn in my life. There's always more to do, more to learn, more to say. And I've always been like that. So one day, Steve and I came into his building together, wanting to proudly tell him that we had just won this festival, wherever it was. And I guess he viewed competitions, as I even alluded to earlier in our talk, that shouldn't be, you're not supposed to be competing in with an art form. And as soon as we walked in, he said, "Oh, the stars have arrived." So he didn't like the fact that we were allowing ourselves to be in competitions. But, that went away. And I learned so much from him. Sadly, talking about Dennis and Buddy Savitt, I've moved 11 times in my life, and I still may be able to find it, but I had all of the music that each of them had written at my lessons, all of it.
Oh, keep them.
Oh,
I
you really got to save them.
I can't find, no, what I'm saying to you, at the moment I can't find them. I know I have them though. Yeah, but I'm not sure where yeah, I know where they are. No, I know how valuable, they are to us, I mean, even the things Buddy wrote out, in the beginning. Oh yeah, amazing stuff, so.